Some stories fade with time, others refuse to die. Hidden deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where fog swallows sound and darkness settles, early lies a case so disturbing that authorities buried the files for decades. It began with a grieving mother and ended with a crime scene that seasoned lawmen refused to speak of again. A woman once praised as a devoted Christian widow. 5 sons who vanished from public life, and a barn quiet by day, but alive at night with the echoes of chains, cries, and something the human mind struggles to comprehend. What pushed these sons, broken and terrified, to finally turn on the woman who raised them? And why does the surviving evidence read less like a crime report and more like a nightmare someone tried desperately to erase? Before we unravel this buried Appalachian horror, take a second to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Your support helps bring these forgotten cases back into the light. Stories many believed would never be told again. From the outside, Delilah McKenna appeared to embody everything the Appalachian community of Millbrook Hollow admired in a woman of her era: resilience, modesty, and unshakable faith. In the autumn of 1884, when the first frost silvered the peaks and the valley gathered to bury her husband, neighbors witnessed what they believed was a portrait of righteous strength. A widow standing beside a fresh grave with 5 boys pressed close to her sides. She wept softly, prayed loudly, and accepted condolences with a kind of solemn dignity that edged her into the townspeople's collective sympathy. Church records from the Millbrook Historical Society describe an outpouring of support: merchants extending credit, farmers helping with harvests, and congregants taking turns dropping off food at her cabin. The Reverend Isaiah Thompson, a man respected for his calm discernment, documented in his diary the compassion the community felt for her and the genuine belief that Delilah would raise her sons with the values that had defined her marriage. But within weeks of the funeral, Thompson began noticing something unsettling beneath her gentle exterior. Delilah returned to his study repeatedly, always under the guise of seeking biblical guidance. Yet her questions were strangely intense, obsessively focused on Old Testament laws, bloodlines, and the absolute duty of sons to obey their mother. She quoted scripture with a rigid fervor that seemed to scorch the air, twisting stories of Abraham and Sarah into justification for isolating her family from worldly corruption. Thompson's diary entries reveal a creeping fear, the sense that grief had not humbled Delilah, but transformed her into something far more zealous and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. As winter bled into spring, the community's perception of Delilah subtly shifted. Though no one yet suspected the horrors taking root behind her cabin walls, neighbors noticed her sons. Once lively, helpful fixtures at barn raisings and church events gradually disappeared from public life. At first, the townsfolk assumed it was simply the weight of farm work and mourning. But Sarah Whitmore, whose property bordered the McKenna, wrote letters describing how the boys no longer played outdoors, tended fields in view of the road, or interacted with other families at Sunday gatherings. When confronted, Delilah explained their absence with a calm, almost sunk severity, insisting God had revealed they must be kept pure from outside influence. Meanwhile, the stored ledgers kept by proprietor Daniel Hayes showed a strange evolution in her purchases: large quantities of laudanum, medical supplies no farming family should need, and heavy chains ordered under the pretext of livestock management. Hayes would later testify that the boys never appeared sick, a detail that unnerved him long before anyone imagined the truth. To the townspeople, Delilah still spoke with the vocabulary of faith, humility, and divine purpose. Yet behind her eyes, something had hardened into fanaticism. Her home slowly transformed from a refuge of grief into a fortress of secrecy, and her sons, once embraced by the valley as fatherless boys deserving of compassion, were being drawn into an isolation so absolute that it severed them from the world. No one could know it then, but Millbrook Hollow's beloved widow had already taken her first steps onto a path that would end in chains, graves, and revelations that would haunt the region for generations. Delilah's transformation from grieving widow to spiritual zealot did not happen overnight. It unfolded in quiet, methodical steps that only became clear in hindsight. Reverend Isaiah Thompson, the last person she spoke to with any regularity outside her sons, captured these early shifts in the diary that would later become key evidence. Shortly after her husband's burial, Delilah began arriving at the church unannounced, always clutching a worn Bible thick with folded pages. At first, she asked ordinary questions about raising boys without a father, but as the months passed, her inquiries grew disturbingly pointed. She fixated on Old Testament passages about purity, bloodlines, and the divine duty of sons to honor their mother above all earthly institutions. Thompson wrote of her feverish fascination with stories like Abraham's lineage, twisting them into a worldview where isolation wasn't protection, but divine mandate. By December of 1884, he described her eyes taking on a zealot's fire, a look that chilled him even though she spoke in soft, measured tones. Delilah claimed she had dreams in which God revealed a special destiny for her sons. Dreams, she insisted, were prophetic instructions, not symbolic grief. When Thompson gently suggested her interpretations were unconventional, Delilah's demeanor shifted from devout widow to something sharp-edged and defensive. She implied that the church's guidance was limited, corruptible, and unnecessary for the higher calling God had placed upon her family. Thompson sensed she was slipping somewhere he could not follow. It's a place where Scripture no longer humbled her, but armed her. By early 1885, Delilah had begun weaponizing isolation with chilling conviction, justifying every step with her increasingly warped theology. Neighbors like Sarah Whitmore wrote letters describing how the McKenna boys were no longer seen walking to school, visiting friends, or even attending church. It's the very heart of community life. Delilah insisted that God warned her against letting her sons mingle with families who carried moral contamination. When questioned, she smiled politely, speaking the language of faith while tightening her grip on every aspect of the boys' lives. Her shifts in purchasing behavior at the general store only deepened concerns. Proprietor Daniel Hayes recorded growing orders of rope, chains, and medical instruments, items far beyond the needs of a modest farm. And yet, Delilah always had explanations ready: livestock repairs, minor ailments, preparations for self-sufficiency. What no one knew was that her private journals, later discovered beneath her floorboards, already contained detailed plans for the barn modifications she believed God demanded. She wrote with a chilling calm about bloodlines, purity, and divine instruction, her handwriting becoming more erratic as her certainty grew. By spring, even Reverend Thompson sensed he was witnessing a person departing from reality, guided not by faith, but by an authoritarian delusion masquerading as divine purpose. When Delilah stopped attending church altogether, he knew she had crossed an invisible threshold. The widow, who once sought comfort in the community, Stodney had now crowned herself a prophet, one whose interpretations would soon unravel into crimes the valley was utterly unprepared to confront. As the months passed, the McKenna boys drifted quietly out of public life, disappearing not in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow erosion that no one fully recognized until it was too late. These were boys once known for helping neighbors plow fields, carrying hymn books during Sunday service, and laughing in the shade of the general store porch. But by mid-1885, their presence in Millbrook Hollow had become a memory. Letters written by neighbor Sarah Whitmore describe her early confusion. She would see shadows moving behind the windows or hear the faint scrape of tools from the barn. Yet the boys themselves never emerged. When asked, Delilah always offered the same calm explanation. God had instructed her to protect her sons from corrupting influences. Her tone was sweet, but her meaning was immovable. The Reverend noted that even when families came bearing food or condolences, Delilah rarely allowed anyone past the threshold. The one so open-hearted had grown defensive, shuttered, and guarded. Visitors began describing odd details: a padlock on the barn door that hadn't been there before, new boards nailed over the windows, and the eerie silence that hung over the yard as though the very soil had grown cautious. What the community interpreted as grief was, in reality, the tightening of a mother's control. The boys' world shrank to the confines of their property, and within that shrinking world, something monstrous was taking shape. Meanwhile, Delilah's purchasing patterns quietly betrayed the transformation occurring behind closed doors. Store ledgers kept by proprietor Daniel Hayes reveal a shift so stark that in hindsight it reads like a warning siren the town never heard. Delilah began ordering medical kits, laudanum in alarming quantities, chains meant for restraining livestock, heavy padlocks, and devices no farming family should have had reason to possess. Hayes noted in his margins that none of the boys appeared ill. Yet Delilah insisted the medicines were necessary for the Lord's preparation. By 1886 and 1887, she was special ordering items that would later be entered into evidence: restraining devices, medical instruments used by midwives, and specialized hardware that no one questioned closely enough. Her explanations were always delivered with the serenity of a woman sanctified by faith, making it difficult for neighbors to challenge her. Meanwhile, the boys became prisoners within their own home, bound not yet by chains, but by a mother's escalating fanaticism and the creeping sense that escape from her authority was impossible. The family farm, once a symbol of Appalachian resilience, hardened into a fortress of secrecy. The community, lulled by Delilah's pious reputation, failed to see the truth. The McKenna boys had not retreated from society on their own. They were being swallowed whole by a mother whose obsession had moved far beyond grief and into a darkness none of them understood. By late 1887, Delilah McKenna's transformation from grieving widow to self-anointed prophet had crystallized into something physical, something investigators would later describe as a structure engineered for human suffering. The first clues surfaced in her private journals discovered decades later beneath her bedroom floorboards. In those early entries, Delilah wrote in neat, disciplined script, describing her belief that God had chosen her eldest son, Thomas, as the vessel for a pure lineage. But as the months progressed, her handwriting fractured into sharp, chaotic strokes, mirroring the violence of a spiraling delusion. She drafted diagrams of the barn, meticulously planning modifications: private stalls reinforced with locks, hooks for restraints, and shelves for medical instruments she had already begun ordering through the general store. Delilah noted precise measurements for chains, timing for fertility cycles, and strategies for ensuring compliance from what she chillingly referred to as participants. Her language was cold, clinical, and devoid of empathy, a stark contrast to the gentle widow the town believed her to be. She documented how each section of the barn should function, how to isolate individuals, how to prevent escape. In her mind, this was no crime scene in the making. It was the sacred workshop of a divine mission. And with every new entry, she moved further from reality and deeper into the blueprint of the nightmare soon to unfold. The physical transformation of the barn took shape quietly, unnoticed by neighbors who had been conditioned to accept Delilah's guarded privacy. From the outside, the structure still looked like an ordinary Appalachian outbuilding: faded wood, sloping roof, smoke curling gently from the chimney when winter descended. But inside, it was becoming something unrecognizable. Investigators would later discover that Delilah had installed heavy chains bolted deep into support beams, built narrow compartments lined with straw, and arranged birthing tools across shelves, as if preparing for livestock. She had turned a simple farming structure into a multi-room facility designed for captivity and forced reproduction. The journals from 1888 detail her testing of restraints, her adjustments to locking mechanisms, and her chilling calculations for optimal outcomes. Every step was planned with precision. Every corner served a purpose. Delilah convinced herself she was fulfilling divine orders, even as she created an environment that defied all human morality. Around this time, the McKenna sons, isolated, malnourished, and psychologically broken, began experiencing the first signs of what would later become years of imprisonment. They heard the hammering late at night, the dragging of chains, the sound of their mother praying in fevered whispers as she worked. They lived within yards of the barn, yet had no idea they would soon become unwilling instruments in its function. By the spring of 1889, the barn stood completely silent. A looming structure that hid horrors no one in Millbrook Hollow could imagine. And Delilah, consumed by her delusion, stepped fully into the role she believed God had written for her. By the mid-1890s, whispers of missing young women were beginning to ripple through the Appalachian communities surrounding Millbrook. Hollow first as isolated tragedies, then as an unnerving pattern. Sheriff William Crawford, a seasoned lawman known for his meticulous record-keeping, had grown uneasy when the third disappearance in 6 months crossed his desk. Each victim fit a similar profile: young, healthy, and from families without the means to mount exhaustive searches. Most troubling of all, each case included a horse found wandering riderless near the remote mountain roads. The woods around Millbrook Hollow were treacherous, but not treacherous enough to explain vanishings without a trace. And yet no one suspected Delilah McKenna, the devout widow who still on rare occasions visited town with a gentle smile and soft-spoken biblical references. When Crawford first questioned her about Martha Henderson's disappearance, Delilah answered with such collected composure that he noted her demeanor as rehearsed. What he couldn't see then was that beneath her calm facade, Delilah was already years into perfecting her abduction methods. She had learned to target young women traveling alone, those least likely to be missed quickly, and she had perfected luring tactics, false offers of employment, promises of shelter, and sometimes sheer force. The breakthrough in Crawford's unease came with an anonymous letter slipped under his office door one stormy night. The writer, later identified as neighbor Samuel Briggs, claimed he heard screams from the McKenna barn during certain nights, always during the full moon. A mixture of women's cries and chains dragging. He wrote words that would later haunt the sheriff. Still, without physical evidence, Crawford was powerless to act. But the seeds of suspicion were firmly planted. Everything changed in the spring of 1896 when a discovery finally shattered the illusion that the disappearances were random. Less than a mile from the McKenna property, Crawford stumbled upon the abandoned campsite of Rebecca Morrison, the fourth missing woman. The scene told a story of violence, torn clothing, scattered belongings, and rope marks on branches where someone had clearly been restrained. Among the debris lay the most damning clue: a torn piece of paper bearing Delilah's handwriting, offering employment as a domestic worker. This was the first physical link between the McKenna farm and the disappearances. Crawford's report describes his growing horror as he cataloged the evidence, including stains later confirmed as human blood. With renewed urgency, he began monitoring the McKenna property from a distance. His logs from 1897 read like the observations of a man watching something unspeakable unfold: lights burning in the barn long past midnight, shadowy figures moving between buildings, supply wagons arriving at irregular hours. Even more chilling, the activities seemed to follow a precise 28 to 30 days cycle. Women were being taken, women were being held, and Crawford knew, though he couldn't yet prove it, that the McKenna barn was the epicenter of an operation far more systematic and horrifying than the community could comprehend. The sheriff's frustration grew as Delilah's political allies delayed warrants and dismissed suspicions. But the truth was no longer hiding. It was pushing, clawing, demanding to be uncovered. Crawford realized he wasn't investigating random crimes. He was circling a fortress built on terror. And every new clue pulled him closer to the dark heart beating inside the McKenna farm. When Sheriff Crawford finally secured a limited search warrant in the autumn of 1897, he expected grim possibilities, perhaps evidence of a kidnapping, perhaps signs of violence. What he found when he stepped into the outer chambers of the McKenna barn, however, was something far beyond crime. It was infrastructure. It was design. It was a system engineered with chilling precision. Hidden beneath hay bales were medical records that documented pregnancies, births, and what Delilah clinically referred to as breeding outcomes. Each woman was identified by initials and page numbers as though they were livestock entries in a farmer's ledger. The handwriting, frantic, slanted, increasingly unhinged, detailed fertility cycles, injection doses, dietary plans, and horrifyingly methods for disposing of what she called failed experiments. Crawford's hands reportedly trembled as he read notes describing the systematic rape of captive women by Delilah's sons, orchestrated with the cold efficiency of a breeder managing stock. Even more shocking were the financial records, tallies of payments, lists of childless couples, and coded references to deliveries. Delilah had been selling the children born in this barn for years, 47 infants in total, according to the ledger found. Many had been placed into unwitting families who believed they were adopting legally. Surrounding these documents were the tools of her operation: chains, restraints, sedatives, strong enough to incapacitate adults, birthing equipment stained by years of use. None of it looked improvised. Everything was deliberate. Yet it was the deeper interior of the barn revealed fully during the 1899 raid that exposed the true scope of Delilah's horrors. Investigators described entering a structure divided into 8 stalls, each outfitted with shackles bolted directly into the support beams. Some restraints still held fragments of skin and hair. Straw bedding was soaked with biological fluids, later confirmed to be blood, urine, and human waste. In the center stood a crude wooden platform Delilah referred to as the examination table, surrounded by anatomical charts and fertility diagrams pinned like trophies to the walls. Deputy Patterson testified that leather restraints still attached to the table were worn smooth from repeated use, a haunting testament to years of suffering. The filing cabinets in Delilah's private office completed the picture: medical reports for victims, correspondence with buyers, and explicit breeding charts that tracked sexual assaults like scheduled farm chores. The brutality did not end with forced pregnancies. Outside, behind the barn, investigators uncovered the first of several burial pits. Within them lay the remains of 7 infants and 3 adult women, victims of complications, malnutrition, untreated infections, or deliberate killings when pregnancies failed. These graves, shallow and unmarked, revealed that Delilah's operation was not merely illegal or immoral. It was an industrialized system of human trafficking and murder. The barn, once a humble outbuilding of an Appalachian farm, has become a clandestine factory of suffering. And until her sons finally revolted, no one had understood the true magnitude of what was happening inside those walls. For years, the outside world believed Delilah's sons were silent, shadowy accomplices, men who helped enforce their mother's reign of terror. But when investigators finally reached their quarters inside the farmhouse, the truth unraveled into something even more tragic. The McKenna brothers were victims, not perpetrators. Sheriff Crawford's team found their rooms lined with chains, restraints, and medical notes documenting malnutrition, untreated wounds, and years of physical abuse. Hidden beneath floorboards were journals, fragile pages filled with desperate scratches rather than confident handwriting. Thomas McKenna, the eldest, wrote of being forced to participate under threat of death, describing moments where he begged his mother to stop hurting the women, only to be threatened or beaten. Jacob's journal contained apologies to the victims and haunting confessions of failed escape attempts. The scratch marks found in the underground escape tunnel matched their accounts: broken nails, torn clothing, bloodstains marking every failed attempt at freedom. Dr. Margaret Foster's psychiatric evaluations later revealed classic signs of coercive control. Psychological conditioning strong enough to bind even grown men beneath a mother's authority. The boys were not soldiers in Delilah's twisted mission. They were prisoners raised inside a nightmare so absolute that they no longer recognized the shape of their own suffering. Their lives had been consumed by fear, manipulation, and the belief that disobedience would mean death for themselves, the captives, or their youngest brother, Samuel. The most heartbreaking evidence came from Samuel's diary, the writings of a boy who had grown up knowing nothing but captivity, barely 15 when the revolt began. Samuel described watching his older brothers endure punishment, starvation, and restraints for resisting Delilah's commands. His entries were filled with dread as he documented the day his mother announced he too would soon be forced into the breeding program. This moment shattered whatever fragile obedience the brothers still clung to. Their journals and hidden notes revealed months of secret communication, coded scratches on barn walls, whispered plans during the few moments they were unchained, careful observations of Delilah's routines. They crafted makeshift weapons from farm tools, collected stolen keys, and waited for a moment when their mother's guard dropped. All the while, they continued performing the roles Delilah demanded, masking their rebellion behind blank stares and hollow compliance. Meanwhile, testimony from the rescued female captives confirmed what the brothers' diaries revealed. They had repeatedly shown remorse, apologized during assaults, and tried to smuggle small comforts, extra food, blankets, whispered encouragement despite knowing punishment awaited them. One captive, Mary Thompson, testified that Thomas wept during an assault, begging his mother to stop before Delilah threatened to kill him. The emerging picture was undeniable. The McKenna sons had lived under a regime of terror so complete that their complicity was born not of malice, but of survival. And when they finally rose against their mother, they did so not as perpetrators seeking redemption, but as victims clawing for the first breath of a freedom they had ever truly known. The McKenna brothers' revolt began long before the moment they broke their chains. It started in the fearful, whispered exchanges carved into the barn walls, in stolen glances that communicated what words could not, and in the shared knowledge that their mother's delusions had reached a point of no return. According to Thomas McKenna's confession, the catalyst was a letter Delilah wrote on March 1, 1899, informing him that their youngest brother, Samuel, would begin contributing to the family mission upon turning 15. That single phrase ignited a fire the brothers had never dared to kindle. They began plotting under the guise of obedience, hiding makeshift tools, memorizing lock patterns, and observing Delilah's rituals with a predator's patience. Their plan hinged on her morning inspection, the only time she removed the shotgun from her shoulder and leaned close to the captives, absorbed in her evaluations. At 3:47 a.m. on April 2nd, Thomas used a carved wooden key shaped over months in secret to free himself. One by one, the brothers slipped from their restraints, quietly positioning themselves around the barn. The air was thick with the smell of straw and fear. When Delilah swung open the barn doors at dawn, expecting silence and submission, she instead found her sons standing in the positions she had trained them to occupy. But this time, they were not waiting for orders. They were waiting for her. The struggle was sudden, violent, and fueled by years of terror. As Delilah stepped toward the examination table, Thomas lunged first, seizing the heavy chains she once used on others and throwing them around her arms. Jacob moved next, grabbing the ring of keys from her apron, as Samuel, still trembling with fear, blocked her path to the shotgun she kept near the entrance. Delilah screamed biblical curses, invoking divine punishment. But the boys had heard it all before. Now they no longer believed her words were holy. They understood them as weapons. The brothers wrestled her to the ground, using the very restraints she designed to immobilize others. Investigators later noted the bitter irony. Delilah was bound with her own devices, locked into the very horror she had built. When Sheriff Crawford arrived hours later, the sight before him was surreal. Delilah chained in the breeding barn and her sons standing around her, exhausted, shaking, but alive in a way they had not been in years. The brothers immediately surrendered, guiding Crawford to the hidden ledgers, the graves, and the surviving captives. Their revolt was not an act of revenge. It was an act of salvation for themselves, for Samuel, and for the women Delilah planned to kill that very day, according to the handwritten orders found in her pocket. In that freezing April dawn, the McKenna farm finally fell silent. For the first time in over a decade, the chains in the barn were still, and the monster who had forged them was no longer in control. The trial of Delilah McKenna, which opened on September 4, 1901, became one of the most widely attended and emotionally charged proceedings in state history. Crowds poured into the Millbrook County Courthouse, spilling into hallways and courthouse steps, drawn by rumors of horrors so unimaginable they seemed like folklore until the evidence laid them bare. Prosecutor Daniel Whitman methodically dismantled any illusion of Delilah as a grieving widow driven mad by loss. He began with the mass graves unearthed behind the barn, presenting coroner reports that confirmed causes of death ranging from childbirth complications to deliberate violence and starvation. The courtroom gasped when Whitman read directly from Delilah's own breeding records. Pages filled with clinical notes about forced pregnancies, infant deaths, and so-called disposition procedures. Sheriff Crawford, with visible strain in his voice, testified about the barn's interior, the examination table, the restraints stained with blood, the medical instruments, and Delilah's extensive correspondence with buyers who purchased the children she trafficked. Her ledger documenting 47 sold infants, each assigned a code, a price, and buyer initials, became one of the most damning pieces of evidence. But it was the testimony of the McKenna brothers that gripped the courtroom in a way no document could. Thomas spoke for 3 days, recounting years of coercion, threats, and torture that forced them to participate in crimes they abhorred. Newspaper accounts from the Millbrook Herald described jurors openly weeping as he described begging his mother to spare victims, only to be met with threats of execution. Delilah's defense team attempted to argue insanity, portraying her as a woman shattered by grief, tormented by delusions of divine mission. But this fragile narrative collapsed the moment Delilah took the stand. In stenographer's transcript, preserved word for word, she declared without hesitation that God had commanded her actions, that purity of bloodline justified any sacrifice, and that every death served a higher design. Her words were chilling not because they hinted at madness, but because they revealed cold, calculated purpose. She did not cry, she did not plead, she justified, she preached. And with every sentence, she sealed her fate. Dr. Margaret Foster's medical testimony confirmed the systematic abuse inflicted on the brothers: malnutrition, untreated injuries, prolonged restraint, solidifying their status as victims rather than accomplices. Forensic evidence tied Delilah directly to the deaths of 36 women and infants. The coded financial records revealed a profitable trafficking network with accomplices across the region. And Delilah's own handwritten confession discovered in her safe eliminated any remaining doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the foreman announced the verdict, guilty on all charges, including 36 counts of first-degree murder and 47 counts of human trafficking, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and grief. Judge Harrison Matthews sentenced her to death by hanging, calling her a predator who weaponized motherhood itself. On December 15, 1901, as dawn broke over the Millbrook jail yard, Delilah McKenna was executed before the families of her victims, her sons, and the sheriff who had fought for years to expose her crimes. Her final words, an unrepentant claim that God would vindicate her only, underscored the monstrous certainty that had driven her. With her death, the darkest chapter in Appalachian criminal history neared its end. But the trauma she inflicted would echo for generations. When Delilah McKenna's body dropped from the gallows on December 15, 1901, the execution brought an official end to her reign of terror. But for the people of Millbrook Hollow, the healing had only just begun. The McKenna brothers, exonerated through overwhelming evidence of coercion and abuse, emerged from the courthouse not as villains, but as survivors who had spent their entire lives entangled in their mother's delusions. Court records from 1902 show that Thomas and Jacob relocated to California, trying to build new lives far from the mountains that had trapped them since childhood. Samuel, Matthew, and Luke, the youngest, emotionally fractured but salvageable, were placed with foster families. Under court protection, their identities changed to shield them from public scrutiny. Yet, even with new names and new futures, the shadows of the barn followed them. Dr. Margaret Foster's final evaluations noted the irreversible psychological trauma, night terrors, dissociation, and lifelong anxiety born from years of captivity. Meanwhile, the families of the missing women finally received answers. Devastating answers, but answers nonetheless. Funerals were held for the victims found in the burial pits. The community grappled with the guilt of having lived beside a predator who wore the mask of a devout widow. Sheriff Crawford praised statewide for his persistence, submitted a final report urging lawmakers to strengthen investigative authority in remote areas, stressing that isolation had been Delilah's greatest weapon. His recommendations planted the seeds for future reforms that would shape state policy for decades. The legal and cultural ripple effects of the McKenna case extended far beyond Millbrook Hollow. State legislators cited the trial transcript when drafting new human trafficking and child protection laws, acknowledging that the system had failed every victim who passed through Delilah's barn. Adoption protocols were overhauled, record-keeping tightened, and safeguards implemented to prevent the underground market Delilah had exploited for nearly a decade. The case also led to increased patrols in Appalachian regions. Recognizing that remote communities, often tight-knit and deeply private, could inadvertently shelter the worst forms of evil in the decades that followed, historians and criminologists revisited the McKenna files not as sensational folklore, but as a sobering study of how isolation, unchecked religious extremism, and psychological domination can converge into unthinkable violence. The complete court archives preserved meticulously in the state historical records stand today as a stark warning. Monstrosity does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a shawl, speaks softly, quotes scripture, and buries its victims beneath familiar soil. Yet the legacy is not solely one of horror. It is also the story of 5 brothers who, despite being born into darkness, found the courage to end a nightmare no one else could see. Their rebellion ensured that the truth, every unbearable detail, would be documented, prosecuted, and remembered. And in that remembrance, the victims who vanished into the Appalachian woods are no longer forgotten shadows. Their stories live on, carved into history with the hope that such silence will never again be allowed to take root.